The studio lights burned hotter than usual as Adam Sandler settled into his chair, the familiar grin fixed in place while the audience roared with approval. He waved, a little bashful, playing the part everyone expected, the easygoing comic who never took himself too seriously. Greg Gutfeld leaned back across from him, arms crossed, eyes sharp with that half-smile that suggested the joke was already forming before the question landed. At first, it was harmless. They traded quips about late nights, bad movies everyone secretly loved, and the strange whiplash of fame that never really loosens its grip. Sandler laughed along, tossing out a few self-deprecating zingers that drew warm applause and put the room at ease. But the tone shifted subtly, like a temperature change you only notice once it's too late. Gutfeld's jokes grew more pointed, less about the work and more about the man. A crack about lazy comedy slipped past the first laugh, then another about Sandler's audience being easy to please. Sandler's smile stayed put, but it no longer reached his eyes. He responded with humor, sure-footed and practiced, but the rhythm felt off. Each punchline landed a little heavier, each pause stretched a little longer. The band filled the silence once, twice, trying to keep the mood buoyant. Gutfeld pressed on, framing the jabs as playful honesty. He teased Sandler for coasting on nostalgia, for making movies critics loved to hate. The crowd laughed, some genuinely, some uncertainly, because laughter felt safer than acknowledging the edge in the room. Sandler nodded, hands folded, listening longer than he needed to. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and unexpectedly reflective. He talked about choosing projects that made people happy, about letters from fans who watched his movies during rough patches of their lives. It wasn't defensive, it was sincere. The applause that followed was louder, steadier, like the audience had chosen a side without realizing it. Gutfeld tilted his head, eyebrows raised, and countered with a joke that skimmed dangerously close to personal. It was the kind of line that might kill in a different setting, with a different guest. Here, it landed with a thud. Sandler exhaled through his nose, the grin finally fading. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and said something that wasn't scripted, something that didn't sound like a punchline at all. He spoke about respect, how comedy worked best when everyone in the room felt human, not reduced to a caricature. His words weren't loud, but they carried weight, and the room quieted as if someone had turned a dial. For a brief moment, it felt like the show might pivot, that the exchange could reset into something thoughtful, even meaningful. The cameras lingered on Sandler's face, catching the seriousness there, the refusal to perform the expected outrage or play the fool. The audience listened, rapt, aware they were watching something unscripted unfold in real time. Even the band stayed silent, instruments poised. Gutfeld chuckled, breaking the stillness, and waved off the tension with another remark about thin skin in Hollywood. The laugh he got was smaller this time, scattered. Sandler sat back, eyes narrowing just slightly, not in anger but in realization. He responded with a story from early in his career, about bombing on stage, about learning when to fight for a joke and when to let it go. His tone was even, but there was steel underneath it now. He wasn't trading barbs anymore, he was drawing a line. The atmosphere in the studio thickened. Crew members shifted behind the cameras. A producer glanced toward the host's desk, fingers hovering near a cue card that suddenly felt useless. Sandler finished his thought and paused, letting the silence do the work. The applause that followed was hesitant at first, then stronger, fueled by a sense that something important had just been said. The smile never returned to his face. Instead, there was resolve, a quiet understanding that the conversation had crossed into territory he wasn't willing to entertain any longer. The silence that followed felt heavier than any punchline. Greg Gutfeld shifted in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk as if searching for the rhythm he'd lost. He fired back with a sharper retort, something about comedians needing thick skin if they wanted to survive on live television. It came out clipped, defensive, and for the first time that night, uncertain. A few audience members laughed out of habit, but most stayed quiet, eyes darting between the two men like spectators at a match that had suddenly turned real. Adam Sandler didn't interrupt, he listened, nodding once, slowly, as though weighing whether the exchange was worth another step. When he spoke again, his voice carried a steady calm that cut through the studio. He said he loved comedy precisely because it was dangerous, because it required trust. You could push boundaries, he explained, but once you stopped seeing the person across from you, the joke stopped being funny. It became something else. The room seemed to lean toward him, even the crew frozen in place behind their cameras. Gutfeld smirked, trying to reclaim the upper hand, and tossed out one last jab about celebrities taking themselves too seriously. That was the moment something shifted in Sandler's expression, not fury, not embarrassment, but clarity. He let out a small laugh, almost to himself, then stood up. The movement startled everyone. Chairs scraped softly. The band looked to the producers for cues that never came. Sandler thanked the audience first, his voice warm again, the way it sounded in old stand-up clips. He said he appreciated the invitation and the chance to talk, but he wasn't interested in turning respect into a spectacle. He nodded toward Gutfeld, not angrily, just conclusively, and said he hoped the rest of the show went well. For a split second, it felt like the host might stop him, might turn it back into a joke, but nothing came. The cameras followed Sandler as he stepped away from the desk, the applause swelling into something loud and genuine, less about taking sides and more about recognizing a boundary drawn in real time. Offstage, the energy changed instantly. Crew members who had been tense moments earlier relaxed, some offering quick smiles or quiet words of support as Sandler passed. He cracked a soft joke to a stagehand about live TV always being an adventure, the tension rolling off him like he'd shed a heavy coat. There was no storming, no shouting, just a deliberate exit that said everything it needed to. Back on set, Gutfeld cleared his throat and tried to move on, tossing to commercial with a forced grin. But the moment lingered, hanging over the studio lights. Everyone knew they'd just witnessed something that couldn't be smoothed over with editing or spin. When the show resumed, the laughter felt thinner, the jokes landing with less confidence, as if the room itself was still processing what had happened. Within minutes of the episode airing, clips spread online. Some headlines screamed about a blow-up, others framed it as a quiet mic drop. Fans replayed the moment Sandler stood up, analyzing his expression, the measured tone of his final words. Comment sections filled with arguments about comedy, respect, and where the line should be drawn. Fellow comedians weighed in, some praising Sandler for walking away, others debating whether live TV thrived on exactly that kind of friction. By morning, the narrative had shifted. It wasn't just about a heated exchange anymore, it was about choice. Sandler hadn't been kicked off in a blaze of chaos, he'd removed himself from a situation that no longer matched who he was. Interviews resurfaced where he talked about growth, about learning when to let go of the need to win every room. That context reframed the moment, turning it into something closer to a statement than a scandal. Gutfeld addressed it briefly the next night, brushing it off as spirited television, but the edge in his voice suggested he knew the segment would follow him longer than he liked. Sandler, for his part, said nothing publicly. No tweets, no statements, just silence that spoke louder than any rebuttal. In the end, the exchange became less about who said what and more about how it ended. A comedian known for silliness had drawn a quiet line, reminding everyone watching that humor didn't have to come at the cost of dignity. And long after the studio lights dimmed, that simple act, standing up, thanking the room, and walking away, was what people remembered most.